in the early 20th century, we build the Panama Canal. And Donald Trump's right, that was American dollars and a lot of American labor, and it was one of the greatest infrastructure projects of the 20th century. 2 out of the 5 marine terminal operators in the Panama Canal are controlled by this company. Now, technically, this company is a Hong Kong-based company, but it's sort of an open secret within the maritime industry that the Chinese Communist Party ultimately has majority ownership. Trump is right to want to support the Monroe Doctrine, that we don't want Chinese influence in Latin America. I would say that the point of the Monroe Doctrine, though, is that you don't threaten to invade an ally in the Western Hemisphere. You push back on the big country that's influencing the Western Hemisphere, and he's got it backwards right now.
And before going into the hot topic of Panama, which the deeper I looked into it, then I understood why President Trump is saying the things he's saying and the concerns that led to where we are today. But before that, I do want to go back to, Trump's first few days in office, his executive orders. How would you compare them to the expectations you had back in October before Trump won the elections?
He issued a range of executive orders. Some of them were not surprising, like withdrawing from the Paris Accord climate agreement or the World Health Organization. We saw those ones coming. Obviously, immigration enforcement we knew was going to be dialed up. At this moment, the immigration enforcement looks to be scoped towards individuals who have committed a crime and are being deported. If that remains the case, that's something that we can jointly agree should be a priority. You commit a crime in this country as an immigrant without documentation, you're out of here. Sealing up the border, that can be an area of bipartisan commitment. Now, if he starts doing mass roundups that sow fear within the immigrant community or that undermine posse comitatus, which prohibits the military from interfering in domestic affairs, that's not acceptable. I think the order that he issued that I found most disturbing, though, was the full commutations and pardons for every single January 6th offender. These were individuals, and Mario, I was there that day in the Capitol. These were individuals who assaulted police officers. They tased them in the neck. They struck them with poles, leading to the deaths of several of these officers. J.D. Vance himself, only a week before Trump did this, said nobody who committed violent offenses should be getting a pardon. And yet individuals who got sometimes 10 years or more in prison for violent acts against a peace officer are now walking the streets with no plans for how to keep the public safe from them.
What about his executive order when it comes to TikTok? How do you expect him to address that issue? There's been a bipartisan concern when it comes to Chinese influence through TikTok and through other private companies. What could Trump do in the next 75 days to be able to resolve this?
Make a deal, sell it to an American company. So I was a co-lead of the TikTok law. I think it is unacceptable that we would allow a Chinese communist-controlled social media platform where 170 million Americans gain the majority of their news and information to dominate the ideological coherence of an entire generation and to attention frack our kids in the way that they are. We need to force a sale to a U.S.-owned company. The way that Trump issued that executive order is illegal. He actually does not have the authority to waive the sale without demonstrating significant process in a negotiation, which he has not demonstrated. I don't see congressional Republicans being willing to enforce that law to the letter against him. And so I think he effectively has 75 days to get a deal.
And what do you think a deal that's something we talk about a lot, me being very active on X and the future of TikTok and the debate between free speech and foreign influence. And that line is starting to get very, very murky. Why do you think a deal wasn't reached under the Biden administration, and what could Trump do differently?
I think it was a game of chicken. And I'm glad you raised this free speech issue. I think this is a really important one. It's one that's important for us to debate. And I have been an ironclad defender of freedom of expression principles my whole political career, including at times when it has been very unpopular. We have to differentiate, though, between the freedom to post whatever you want. And that is a sacrosanct First Amendment right, for any American. They can say bad things about me. They can say bad things about Donald Trump or Joe Biden. That is protected speech. An algorithm that is owned by a foreign adversary does not have civil liberties. And the suppression or amplification of content is itself an editorial decision. And to outsource that decision-making to the Chinese Communist Party is, I think, profoundly bad, not just national security policy, but just bad for our digital town square. We want social media platforms that build community, not build tribes.
Yeah, and it's also based on the values. The values of the CCP are very different to the values in a democracy like the United States. So allowing an algorithm controlled by an autocracy is very different to an algorithm controlled by a private company within a democracy. So I agree with you there, and I think that line is going to be very interesting to tread. And we'll see what happens over the next 2 months. Congressman, I think the main focus of today's discussion is Panama. I didn't, when I first heard about the issue with the Panama Canal, it didn't even come across my mind as that being a national security risk for the US. But when I started researching the rapidly growing and kind of silently growing Chinese influence in Latin America as the US and the West is distracted in the Middle East and even distracted in Asia Pacific, I started to realize how far China has come. And this is an area you've got a lot of experience in. And with your background, sir, can you just give the listeners a bit of an overview on why this matters and how we got here?
I would love to, Mario, and if it's okay with you, I think we start with a very quick survey of the history behind the Panama Canal, because I think that's helpful for context. And just for our listeners' awareness, I come at this as someone who served on the Select Committee on China, where we investigated Chinese influence and our competition with China, as well as a former Marine officer. I deployed to Panama in command of a counter-narcotics mission in 2014 and worked with the Panamanians and patrolled with them alongside the Colombians and U.S. special operators. The first place to start is 200 years ago with the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says outside powers can't mess in the Western Hemisphere. And since then, that has been a core pillar of U.S. foreign policy. I support the Monroe Doctrine, and that's a bipartisan commitment in Congress. All right, let's fast forward another 100 or so years, and Americans start to realize that, boy, it would be really convenient to not have to circumvent the entirety of the South American continent and be able to transit from East Coast to West Coast right through that narrowest isthmus in Panama. And starting with Teddy Roosevelt and then ultimately in the early 20th century, we build the Panama Canal. And Donald Trump's right, that was American dollars and a lot of American labor, and it was one of the greatest infrastructure projects of the 20th century. The United States controlled the Panama Canal for a while. It was becoming an increasing source of tension with the nation of Panama. And then in a treaty in the 1970s, there was an agreement, and we gave it to the control of Panama, and specifically to the Panama Canal Authority. The Panama Canal Authority is not actually really a state organization. It's sort of a quasi-governmental organization, and it's broadly considered to be very professionally run, the Panama Canal Authority. Under that treaty that established this and established Panamanian sovereignty over the Panama Canal, it was agreed that the United States could defend the Panama Canal militarily if its neutrality were ever impugned upon, and that the United States Navy would get preference in its transit through the canal. All right, fast forward to the end of the 90s. At that time, there is a bidding process for some maritime terminal operators on either side of the Panama Canal, Atlantic side and Pacific side, and a Hong Kong-based company, CK Hutchison, bids on it, and the bid's kind of dirty, and Congress actually said at the time there were some irregular bidding patterns, but it won it. And then it actually re-won it during the Trump's first administration. 25 years later, this Hong Kong-controlled company re-won the rights to control marine terminal operations on the Atlantic side and the Pacific side. 2 out of the 5 marine terminal operators in the Panama Canal are controlled by this company. Now, technically, this company is a Hong Kong-based company, but it's sort of an open secret within the maritime industry that the Chinese Communist Party ultimately has majority ownership through its actors and institutions at that company. There has not been any demonstration of malfeasance on behalf of CK Hutchison in its operations. And there also hasn't been any explanation of how those marine terminal operators on either the Pacific or the Atlantic side would impair the transit of ships from east to west or west to east. You can't close down the canal through a port. It doesn't work that way unless they were going to actually send Chinese military vessels there, which they have not done. I will stop there on the history lesson. We can happy to go into the details on what I'm worried about and what I'm not worried about. But suffice to say that Trump is right to want to support the Monroe Doctrine, that we don't want Chinese influence in Latin America. I would say that the point of the Monroe Doctrine, though, is that you don't threaten to invade an ally in the Western Hemisphere. You push back on the big country that's invading or that is influencing the Western Hemisphere, and he's got it backwards right now.
Going to the Monroe Doctrine, my first question is, why are we enforcing it now? The U.S. has had 20 years of being able to stop China, and it feels like it's, I wouldn't say too little too late, but definitely too late to act now.
It's not too late to act now, and I'll give you an example. Parallel to the Panama Canal is a railroad, and that railroad is synergistic with the Panama Canal. Sometimes there's multimodal freight, and it's hugely important for the operations of the canal. that railroad is coming up for a bid. And I would not be surprised if a Chinese company tries to buy it. And I think it is well within U.S. rights to say, actually, we really don't want a Chinese company to buy that railroad. I think it's also well within U.S. prerogative to say to the Panama Canal Authority, hey, we really want to see an audit of C.K. Hutchison, which they're beginning to do, which controls the marine terminal operations on both sides of the canal. And based on the results of that audit, we want to understand if there's any concerns about Chinese communist control over this company. I think that's fair game too. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have insight into and transparency over critical infrastructure. The challenge is that Donald Trump right now is threatening to use force against a small ally without demonstrating any casus belli, and it's making us look reckless and feckless. If we're trying to win hearts and minds in South America, we better show up with trade and investment deals. We better show up with natural resource extraction or local media influence. We're not doing any of that right now. In fact, during Trump's first administration, his ambassador to Panama resigned after a year because he was so frustrated and embarrassed by how Trump was handling Panamanian affairs. Trump never replaced that ambassador. And instead, Panama went ahead and was the first Latin American country to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. So Trump took his eye off the ball in his first term, and now in his second term, he's trying to make up for it, but he's coming across as overly belligerent.
So you're saying that's back in 2017 when also Panama changed their stance on Taiwan, and I think that convinced Costa Rica to do the same, if I remember, or Dominican Republic to do the same a year later, allegedly. So we can't prove that. But when you look at Chinese influence, it's not only Panama; it extends to Brazil, to Peru, to Argentina, and China has invested in over 130 ports globally, and a bunch of them are in Latin America. Two questions I have. First, what strategies does the U.S. have? Increasing trade with Latin America. You talked about not allowing certain Chinese companies to invest in railroads and ports in Latin America, but how can this be done within legal means? I feel like the U.S. influence in Latin America has diminished over the last 10, 15 years.
I agree with that. I think there's some green shoots there with Argentina and Malay. It's a strong relationship right now between those two countries. I think we have an opportunity in Peru. Peru is in deep talks with the Chinese over resource extraction and shipping, and I think we can wedge in there. We're seeing more and more Latin American countries getting nervous about deals with Chinese telecom or data storage companies, particularly for their state-run telecom infrastructure, and I think we have an opportunity to wedge there. But here's the thing.
Is that because of the security risk when it comes to Huawei?
Yes. I mean, one of reasons, yes. You can't fight something with nothing. And this is my frustration. To be candid, I would apply this to both administrations, actually, Trump and Biden, is you got to show up to Latin America, to Africa, to Southeast Asia, and offer mutual market access, offer trade and investment deals. China has Belt and Road. Now, there's a lot of analysis and debate about how effective Belt and Road has actually been. They tend to use Chinese labor. They have very onerous debt terms. But you know what? They're building railroads and power stations, and they're exporting nuclear power plant technology, and they're building telecom out. And the United States shows up, and too often we show up with the lecture, and we don't show up with the goods. And I want to see, at the same time as we tightly scope our economic relationship with China to de-risk it, we have to, at the same time, radically expand our economic ties with the global South, which is growing fast in population and in influence.
I want to talk about what that means for the U.S. So you said that it's essentially the east and west entry points to the canal are not owned, but the license has been won for about 50 years by the Chinese company or the Hong Kong-based company, and that seemingly seems like a Chinese shell company. So what could China do? You cannot just shut off the canal. Can they legally send military vessels there, which I don't think that's included in the license agreement? So what could China do with those canal entries?
That is really at the very core of the debate right now, and that is where the Trump administration is not being forthcoming with Congress. If they have a concrete set of security concerns about how those two marine terminal operations are being used against U.S. national security, actively being used or very plausibly could be used, I want to hear that. I want to hear that, and we have to better understand that. They are not forthcoming with that information. There is some hand-waving about, Chinese troops are in the Panama Canal. No, they're not. No, they are not, at least not in any kind of briefing that I have seen. That would be absolutely a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and we would absolutely not accept that. And we have a treaty right already to prevent that from happening. We don't need any more negotiations. There's also some hand-waving about these marine terminal operators, because they can surveil the cargo that's transiting across the canal, right? And just for people's awareness, about 5% of all global trade goes through the Panama Canal. And of that, more than half is U.S. goods. So we obviously have a big stake. Number 2, by the way, is China. That's actually, I don't really think that's true, that they can actually surveil what's inside these ships. As you know, these ships are mostly big container ships, and you don't get manifest data usually as marine terminal operators. You sort of just know it's a big ship. Here's how many containers we have, but they don't actually have, I think, granular insight into what's being shipped itself. The final point that sometimes Trump makes is, we're getting a bad deal on this. They're overcharging. Again, zero evidence for that. The Panama Canal Authority has a very transparent process for rate setting. As there has been less water for the Panama Canal, they've had to raise rates because they've had to reduce the number of ships that can transit at any given time. That's applied equally, and they've had a tiering system for doing it that's not based on geopolitics. It's based on the ship type. And the U.S. Navy gets preference, actually, to transit through the canal. So if anything, we get a slightly better deal than any other country.
Another concern that people have is, I was surprised by these numbers. So China, and that's something that you probably know a lot about as well. China supplies a lot of the precursor chemicals used to manufacture fentanyl. And
yes,
obviously you know how big of an issue that is around the world, including the US. The latest numbers were fentanyl claims about 100,000 lives a year. And one concern is that the canal is being used to import some of those chemicals into Panama and then transported across to the US. Is that a concern that you've heard about? Is that a concern that you share?
It's no question that the Chinese are exporting almost the entirety of fentanyl precursors. And not only are they exporting on the front end the precursors that then get pill pressed, they are also money laundering on the back end. As I said, I'm a member of the Select Committee on China. I was the co-chair of the fentanyl working group on that Select Committee. And we co-led 3 bipartisan bills to crack down on Chinese exports of fentanyl. The most effective way to do this is to go directly to the source. If you're trying to get at fentanyl, which is, the amount that can fit inside of a shoe is enough to pill press 1,000 pills. If you're trying to get at that fentanyl when it's inside of a Maersk container ship that is as big as 2 football fields, you're doing it wrong. That's the wrong time to get to it. The right time to get to it is at the 24 or so Chinese chemical manufacturers on the mainland who mostly have licit business in chemical manufacturing, but have a side hustle doing illicit fentanyl manufacturing, by the way, subsidized and facilitated by the Chinese Communist Party. We have a bill to sanction those Chinese manufacturers. We also have a bill that would, at ports of entry, require detailed manifests. And if they don't have them, they would get fined for a lack of transparency. We absolutely have to address it. Addressing it when it's in transit on a big ship is not the right way to do it. You got to do it at the source.
When you say at the source, you're talking about China. How can you address it? Is that coming to some sort of agreement with China, coming to some sort of deal? How else could you address it?
Certainly a deal. I oftentimes say that 2 near-term wins that Donald Trump could get with China are 1, stop exporting fentanyl, and 2, stop importing Iranian oil. If we could get China to do those 2 things, neither of which are a strategic priority for China, right? I'm not even talking about Taiwan, which they consider a core interest. I'm talking about 2 things that are, frankly, sort of sideshows for them. If we could get them to stop doing those 2 things, the relationship could permanently be at a slightly higher level. And I think, if Donald Trump can cut that deal, I'll support that deal. That's not a partisan issue. We're losing 70,000 Americans every year to fentanyl overdoses.
You seem to agree with Trump's concerns. You seem to agree with the concern of China's expansion into Latin America. I think where you don't agree with President Trump is the way he's addressing the issue. He seems to address it and he's doing the same thing when it comes to the Ukraine war and Russia, a carrot and stick approach. And right now he's using the stick with Panama. And then what we could see over the next few weeks is more of a carrot approach, coming to some sort of deal and moving the influence away from China. How would you address it if you were in President Trump's shoes?
I would stay focused on China. The problem with threatening to use military force against a country, a strategic ally that is smaller than New York City, is it doesn't make the United States look like we're strong and in charge globally. It makes us look reckless and feckless. It makes us look like a bully that is kind of lashing out because we're not doing some of the basics right on trade and investment and diplomacy. And it undermines other countries' confidence in using the Panama Canal and their confidence that the Panama Canal will continue to be competently and fairly run. That system where we have international institutions that everyone can kind of subscribe to and trust has served the American people exceptionally well over the last 70 years of the Pax Americana. And to burn it down without any demonstration of evidence is pretty irresponsible. I have no problem with him, though, in particular, if I were in that seat, saying to the Panama Canal Authority, hey, I want to see an audit of CK, and I want to understand whether they're violating their contracts, because maybe we want to put them back up for bid. Again, it was during his first term that they went up for bid and the Chinese bought them, so he's going to make up that ground. I do not want this railroad sold to a Chinese company. And oh, by the way, I'm going to appoint an ambassador to Panama and an ambassador to Colombia and Brazil and Argentina who is going to start doing serious trade and investment deals to counter the Chinese. I'm talking about using the Development Finance Corporation to crowd in private capital and build data centers and build critical mining and build ports. We got to show up and we got to do business there.
Okay, and one thing that China's done is they've already done, they've increased their trade with Latin America, they've increased their investments, and they've been doing it for a long time. How would it, so my two questions is, there's two paths across to this. So one is the US starts to focus on Latin America and try to reverse that. And the other one is the US gets distracted in other geopolitical conflicts or other priorities. Can you explain the both paths to listeners? If the US goes down and tries to reverse Chinese influence in Latin America, you've talked about some of the ways of doing that. But if that fails or the US gets distracted again, what could happen on our borders or American borders?
Yeah, so I very rarely think about this from what's China going to do next. And I more think about it from what America can do next. I'm a history nerd, Mario, and one of my favorite anecdotes is from the Civil War. U.S. Grant had just taken over the overall command of the Union Army, and they were prepared to go to battle again with Robert E. Lee in 1864. And Grant's top commanders were sitting around the fire before the first set of big battles, and they were lamenting and complaining and worrying about what Robert E. Lee was going to do. And they were talking about how at Chancellorsville and at Fredericksburg, he licked us here and he killed us there. And Grant just snapped and he said, stop talking about what Robert E. Lee is going to do to us and start talking about what we're going to do to him. And that needs to be the attitude that the United States takes to China. Stop worrying about what China is going to do. It's a 1.3 billion people. It's a 5,000-year-old civilization. We know they're super good at math and science and engineering. Like, they're going to do impressive stuff. And there's not a whole lot that we can do to, I think, curtail a civilization with that much latent potential and talent. What we can do, though, is lean into our strengths and be the strongest economy in the world that every other economy, whether it's Nigeria or Indonesia or Brazil, wants to do business with. And that they want to plug in to the U.S. operating system, the rule of law, open trade and investment, dominance of the blue water, instead of the CCP operating system, which is based on mercantilist practices and is based on a Middle Kingdom approach to sovereignty.
I think understanding the strategy or the intentions behind China's expansion, is it eventually reaching a deal when it comes to Taiwan, for example? Is it trying to enlarge their influence around their neighbors without having, you've got all these military bases, American military bases on Japanese islands, in the Philippines and Singapore, all around China. So trying to understand China's strategy, are they trying to increase their influence in Latin America in order to reach some sort of agreement when the time comes regarding Taiwan? Are they trying to come to some sort of agreement with the US to move the military bases away from their border? What I try to envisage is, kind of being more direct. With the rise of a new empire, and you've got two empires now with the US and China, it's very difficult for both to coexist peacefully. And it seems that both are trying to increase their influence and both are trying to gain some strategic advantages, especially when it comes to China. So you seem a bit more optimistic about it, but it's also a bit naive for the US to completely ignore the rise of China.
We can't ignore it. But after 2 years on the Select Committee on China, I have been absolutely convinced that the United States is going to win this contest with the Chinese Communist Party if we want to. If we do the things within our control, if we uphold the rule of law, if we unlock free enterprise and entrepreneurship, if we have the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency, if we uphold the Pax Americana by being strong allies, if we build a U.S. Navy that is dominant on the blue water, if we manage our federal debt so that we're not paying more in our interest payments than we are for military, if we do what in the Marine Corps infantry we would call the simple but not easy things, we're going to win this thing. And the reason we're going to win this thing is that our ideas are better than the Chinese Communist Party's ideas. We fundamentally believe in the inherent worth and value of every individual, and they believe that individuals are pawns of the state. And I think that our idea is better than their idea.
But you've got different countries. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
but just on that initial point, you've got BRICS. Different people argue how strong the BRICS is, but it's definitely stronger than it was 5-10 years ago. You've got the Chinese military is growing at an exponential rate. I think I read somewhere that in every 4 years they're creating a navy that's bigger than the British Navy, British naval forces. So it just seems that focusing on just growing as a country for the US just to grow and ignoring those strategic threats could lead to a similar path to where it's led to over the last 20 years. The US has neglected what China's done in Latin America. They've neglected what China's done in Africa. And we're in the position we are today.
I'm agreeing with you. Strongly agree with that. That's why I reject the protectionism of, frankly, both the Trump and the Biden administrations, which has been to pull back from economic engagement with the global South. We have to be everywhere, competing everywhere. The Trans-Pacific Partnership in Southeast Asia is a great example. This was a multi-nation pact that had high standards for environment and labor and country of origin. And the United States really was the architect of this trade deal. At the last moment, Donald Trump pulled out of it in his term one. You know who the biggest trading partner now of those countries is? It's China, right? Like the Indo-Pacific is home field advantage for China. We have to go 14,000 miles across the Pacific to get there. We cannot compete in the Indo-Pacific against them as a hegemon unless we have allies. We need Japan. We need South Korea. We need the Philippines. We need Australia. We need Indonesia. We need Thailand. And we're not going to get these countries on board with us when they're small and looking up at a massive country to their north unless we are working with them not just militarily but economically as well. My only point is, go ahead, Mario.
Go ahead. No, I was going to ask, so my question though is, what is China's end goal? Because you said, we shouldn't worry too much about China. We should just focus on our own growth and our own issues that we're facing. Yeah. But if I did ask you, is China's end goal to challenge the US? Is China's end goal just simply Taiwan and they're going to continue, remaining within their territory, not expand as the US has over the last few decades?
I love that question, Mario. I think it's, in fact, the most important question to ask is, yes, you have to know thyself. You have to also know your enemy. What is the Chinese Communist Party and what do they want? And I have come to believe that the Chinese Communist Party is fundamentally a Han supremacist party. That they are, in the same way that you see ethno-nationalist parties across the world gain more power in recent years, they are fundamentally an expression of Han supremacy and Han nationalism. And they are saying, their sort of fuel for their ideological fire is that for 5,000 years, the Han people were most of the time the most sophisticated civilization in the world. You could argue at different moments whether it was Persia or Western Europe that was doing some of the best science and culture, but over the course of those 5,000 years, Han civilization was almost consistently one of the richest, most sophisticated civilizations. And then in the 80s and the 90s, they were humiliated. They were humiliated by colonialism and by the opium trade and by being carved up and by civil war. And what the CCP offers its people is not just stability and improved economic growth. Those are parts of its contract with the people. It also offers a national rejuvenation. And Xi Jinping talks about this a lot. And Taiwan needs to be understood as part of that national rejuvenation because Taiwan is majority Han. The challenge that Xi Jinping sees with Taiwan, though, is the older generation of Taiwanese consider themselves Han Chinese. They self-identify as Han Chinese. The younger generation of Taiwanese, though, consider themselves Taiwanese ethnically. If you are Xi Jinping, that feels like a ticking time bomb demographically. That feels like if you wait another generation, you're going to lose Taiwan. I don't mean militarily, I mean you're going to lose Taiwan culturally. And that is a core threat to his vision of Han supremacy. That also explains, by the way, the persecution that you see in Tibet and in Xinjiang province. Those are the only two provinces within China, mainland China, that are not majority Han. So the two provinces that are not majority Han to a Han supremacist party need to be persecuted. And it also, the final point I'll make on this, is it explains some of the genius of Lee Kuan Yew, the Singaporean leader, who's oftentimes called the most brilliant statesman of the second half of the 20th century, because Singapore is also dominated by Han Chinese. And yet it is the one place that has been dominated by Han Chinese that's managed to break the orbit of the CCP. And that's a testament to how skilled Lee Kuan Yew was at geopolitics.
And how far do you think the US, and I know you have a vote in about 10 minutes or so, so I'll be quick, but how far do you think the US should and will go in defending Taiwan? Do you think Taiwan is just a lost cause right now and it will be part of China? However, what we're discussing is not whether, but on what terms will the US agree to let China invade Taiwan, for lack of a better term?
So I do not think Taiwan is a lost cause at all. And I would put forward a couple reasons why. First, the PLA is not at this point equipped to do an amphibious assault that has to cross the strait, land on a beach, go over the mountains, and then engage in urban warfare. That's hard. That is really hard to do. I don't care how big your army is. The Chinese Navy hasn't won an engagement since the 14th century. So we're not talking about a military that actually has any real wins under its belt. You're 100% right, Mario, that they're building, I think, 70% of the world's ships and like 98% of the world's containers and a supermajority of the world's
drones
infrastructure. Well. Yeah, no, it's like they are outbuilding us on every single facet. Don't get me wrong, and it's a real problem, and we need a domestic shipbuilding industry, and actually that could be a bipartisan area of focus with Trump. But it's one thing to build the ships, it's the other thing to use them to engage in a shooting battle. And that's a hard task. The PLA is not ready. The PLA Navy is not ready to do it, and they've been riven through with corruption. The second is that the Taiwanese are taking increasingly seriously their obligations to self-defense. They've extended their term limits for mandatory enrollment in the armed forces there from 4 months to a year, and you're seeing broad-based civil society support for the concept of defense in depth, that they have to be what they call a porcupine, where it's just indigestible. What they have to do next, though, is they have to make themselves not just indigestible, but also unsuffocatable, because they import Taiwan something like 90% of their energy and like 60% of their food. That is a real problem for an island, right? Because you could see the Chinese Navy, maybe they're not ready to do an invasion, but they could do a blockade.
Choke them off.
Choke them off. So, but we can't, the United States needs to maintain a strategic ambiguity posture. We need to continue to arm Taiwan as we have, and we need to continue to help Taiwan help itself, because we have about a 10-year of a danger window. I think if we can get through that 10-year danger window of Xi Jinping's rest of his term, you might see the CCP moderate on its maximalist position regarding Taiwan.
So there's essentially two main fronts right now between the US and China. One is obviously just the South China Sea and all these islands around Taiwan, the Japanese and the Japanese islands around Taiwan. And you've got obviously Korea, the Philippines, where the US has expanded military presence significantly recently. And you've got Latin America. How far has China expanded militarily, if at all, from an intelligence perspective, intelligence gathering, when it comes to Cuba? And obviously, you understand economically they've expanded significantly, but from an intelligence and military perspective, is there any red flags or any concerns yet?
There's lots. They're expanding significantly. We've already talked about their expansion of their Navy, which is a highly capable Navy. It used to be said that, yeah, they were building lots of ships, but they weren't as good as our ships. Yeah, that's not really.
Expanding within Latin America. So there's no military presence, Chinese military presence whatsoever in Latin America, at least not as far as we know. Is that though a concern? Is there other concerns there that in the either, like for example, there's reports, and it hasn't been confirmed, but there's reports that China is involved in intelligence gatherings from Cuba when it comes to the military bases in Florida, U.S. military bases?
I think we have to presume that China is everywhere, that they are now globally engaged. And there are so many different vectors that we can talk about, sort of transnational repression of their diaspora. We could talk about lawfare in both international and domestic courts of law and how they bully companies and espionage. Let me just focus on two, though, information and energy, because those are the two that to me are the most vital vectors of U.S. State competition. On energy, I am deeply concerned that they are eating our lunch on nuclear power R&D, and nuclear power production. They are going to be an exporter of nuclear power to the global south. And nuclear power is the most effective form of clean energy. And you can imagine in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, a bunch of countries are using Chinese nuclear energy to desalinate their water, to power their electrification grid, to run their railroads. And China can turn that off. On the other hand, we got information. It's not just TikTok and it's not just their increasing use of local journalism to kind of bend their story. It's also information at the infrastructure level with their telecom. We've seen in the United States, they have Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, where they are deeply hacked into our telecom system. They are doing even worse in other countries. And the United States posture needs to be energy and information overmatch against China.
How deep is that infiltration, in your opinion, when it comes to the American energy grids and information networks as well?
I'll give you one publicly reported example, Mario, which is that it's quite clear that the Chinese now know every mobile phone that called or texted an FBI agent. That's a problem, right? Like, that's a problem for a very obvious set of reasons. They can build a social graph now around the FBI. They can figure out which of their maybe Chinese nationals who are in the diaspora here might be engaged with U.S. counterintelligence. Like, this is a real issue. And the United States, one, we need to play defense. We also got to play offense, not in both energy and information. We have got to be net exporters of nuclear energy technology. We have to be engaged in the global South in particular in helping shape the narrative of the West and the United States, working with journalists, working with social media platforms. Like, we got to take this fight to them.
Do you mean, as a final question, Congressman, do you mean that the U.S. should engage in similar tactics as China? Cyber attacks on Chinese infrastructure, for example, getting into their systems as China has done to the U.S., collecting data, and how extensive has that been on the American side?
I mean, the National Security Administration, the NSA, remains the most capable cyber offensive unit in the world, and the Chinese know that, and they know that, what goes around comes around, let's put it that way. So I think that we have demonstrated prowess in that. But to your broader point of do we have to play by their tactics? No, is the short answer. And it goes back to this concept that they've had to build a great firewall, and they've had to create really an alternative internet universe for their population, because ultimately they need to control civil society. And the whole idea of the United States, and the whole idea, I think, of sort of post-Enlightenment societies is we believe in freedom of expression, free minds, free markets. And we're not trying to suppress ideas. We just want an open marketplace of ideas, and we want the truth to be told. And that means supporting institutions and constitutions of knowledge throughout the world. Yeah,
Congressman, it's a really, really good discussion. What started off as an issue no one was talking about just a few months ago when it comes to the Panama Canal, to now being a broader geopolitical risk between China and the US. It seems everything geopolitically is starting to gradually involve China more and more, whether it's the Middle East, whether the war in Ukraine, and obviously what's happening in Latin America. So I think your expertise in that area is something that's gonna become more and more handy. I really appreciate your time, sir.